Before we start looking at pricing strategy, which is going to occupy us for the next couple of weeks, we need to go back and have a look at the ideas behind the demand curve. And in particular, there's a concept called consumer surplus that we need to examine. So the idea of consumer surplus, as I say on this slide, is it's a way of measuring what the buyers are getting out of a transaction. I've mentioned before that whenever exchanges take place between buyers and sellers, it obviously must be the case that both buyers and sellers expect to be better off in some sense. The exchange is voluntary, so people must expect to be better off. Perhaps after the exchange is over, maybe somebody's not going to be better off. Maybe they bought something whose quality was poor or whatever. We're not interested in that sort of thing right now. We're interested in what people expect to get when they buy something. Now, we've been looking at things from the point of view of the seller, and we've been focusing on profit maximization, and in particular the concept of profit contribution, the difference between price and marginal cost. From the buyer's viewpoint, what we need to do is to compare what the buyer would have been willing to pay, the maximum amount that the buyer would have paid, with the price that the buyer actually had to pay. The difference is called consumer surplus. And if you think about anything that you purchased yourself, you could just think about what consumer surplus you got out of it. You could ask yourself, what's the maximum amount that I would have paid for this or that, and what do I actually pay? And you will realize that you got some kind of surplus out of it. Otherwise, you wouldn't have bought the thing. So, to understand consumer surplus, we need to go back and think about what the demand curve is telling us. So we need to ask, how does that show the benefits that buyers are getting? And from the point of view of pricing strategy, the key question that we need to ask is, how can the firm take some of the consumer's benefits and add it to profits? Okay, so let's have a look at an individual's demand curve, just to understand what's going on there. I've made up a rather unrealistic example here, in which we can ask a person how much they were willing to pay for different cups of coffee. So we are imagining a person buying cups of coffee per day. And we can ask, what's the maximum amount that you would have been willing to pay for the first cup of coffee? Now, I just want to add that the willingness to pay is obviously going to depend on things like what substitutes are available and where they're located. That's going to determine how much somebody is going to be willing to pay for an individual seller's cup of coffee. So I've just made up some numbers here. Let's suppose that somebody was willing to pay $6 for their cup of coffee, but it only cost them $2. Obviously, in that case, the person got a surplus, namely the difference between what they would have been willing to pay and what they actually did pay. There's a basic sort of psychological assumption that economists make that willingness to pay declines the more of something you consume in a given period of time. Certainly, I think if you are a coffee drinker or a tea drinker or something like that, you will recognize that the more of that you have in a particular period of time, the less additional satisfaction or utility you get from having another one. In other words, your willingness to pay is going to be declining. So I've made up some numbers here, and we can see the difference between what a person was willing to pay and what they actually paid is positive up to the point where they don't buy any more. Obviously, in this case, the fifth cup of coffee only gives $1.30's worth of satisfaction. That's all this person is willing to pay for the fifth cup, and it costs $2, so it would make no sense to buy it. What we can do is just add up those green areas and come up with a dollar figure, so we can say how much surplus this person had. We can do exactly the same thing with the market demand curve. So what I've been looking at here is just the demand of a single individual for a particular product. We can look at the market as a whole, add up the willingness to pay of all buyers in the market at different possible prices. That gives us our market demand curve. So we've just added up the demand for each potential customer. And if this particular price is set, of course the demand curve is just telling us how much we're going to sell. So we know that the firm's total revenue is just price times quantity sold, but now we've got a name to attach to the difference between what people would have been willing to pay as described by the demand curve and the actual price that was charged. You'll notice that I've drawn the demand curve as a straight line. The individual's demand curve looked like a series of steps. You can regard this as kind of an approximation of that. Or perhaps the good that's being sold is divisible so that we don't have individual units like cups of coffee. Maybe we're talking about coffee beans or something like that. If we have a look at the profit that the firm is getting, the price that it's charging, we can go back to this familiar picture. So here's our single price firm. We're looking at the firm's demand, its related marginal revenue. I've made the assumption that in this particular case for this product, we've got constant marginal costs. And here's our profit maximizing price. This is all familiar territory. I'm just using a picture that we've seen before. So the area underneath the marginal cost curve is just telling us the firm's variable costs. It's just adding up the marginal costs of producing each additional unit of output. That's just going to be our variable cost. And this area here that I've colored in yellow is going to be our profit contribution, the difference between the price and marginal cost. Now that I've put, of course, the average cost information here, we can see what total costs are. That's just going to be the average cost multiplied by the total quantity, just by the definition of average cost. So we can see that everything above this $11.25 describes the firm's economic profit in this case. Well, we're now in a position to add that last concept, consumer surplus. So where we're going from here is the next step really to say, well, what happens if the firm doesn't have to charge just a single price? Suppose it can set different prices for different people. Suppose it can discriminate among its customers. Here, no discrimination is taking place. Everybody is being charged exactly the same price.